More recently, and in fact, I had to go back and update this lecture, a fourth person visited the Challenger Deep. This case, it was an American businessman named Victor Vescovo in May of 2019. He went just a little bit further than Cameron did. Cameron reached a depth of about, and I'm going to apologize again for using imperial instead of metric units. Cameron reached a depth of about 35,787 feet. Vescovo reached a depth of about 35,813 feet. Still impressive for both of those gentlemen. Once again, I won't expect you to know those depths, but, just to say, hey, Cameron was beat out here by Vescovo. So Vescovo set a new world record. Once again, he discovered at least 4 new species. This was just done in May of 2019, so scientists are still analyzing data and samples that he collected. This is part of something that he calls the 5 Deeps expedition. He's trying to be the first person to travel to all 7 high summits on all 7 continents, as well as the 5 deepest parts of the world. And sadly enough, what he did find when he was down there was not only new species of fish, but plastic garbage as well. He did bring back footage of a plastic bag at the bottom of the ocean floor. As I said, this is part of what Vescovo is calling the 5 Deeps expedition. He's already traveled to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Southern Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and he still has the Arctic Ocean left to go. There is a website, and once again, I've provided the link to the website if you want to go and have a look and get a little bit more background on what he has done and what he's discovering and what he plans to do in the Arctic Ocean. Finally, it's not only humans that we send down to the bottom of the ocean floor to the Challenger Deep, but we also send remotely controlled vehicles as well. So these are submersibles that are controlled by someone up in a ship or even someone in an office somewhere, anywhere in the world. And this lets us look at the deeper parts of the ocean without actually involving any of the high risks to human life. Because as you can imagine, if something goes terribly wrong on these expeditions, the results can be disastrous. We've talked about some of the modern day explorers of the ocean. Picard, Walsh, Cameron, and Vescovo. But let's take a look now and go back to how ocean exploration began, some of the different cultures that are associated with oceanic exploration, and some of the history of oceanography and the study of oceans as a science. This will be by no means a complete coverage of all the history of marine exploration science, but we'll highlight some of the key points over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years of ocean exploration. It's important to note as we start off with the discussion of oceanography and the exploration of the ocean that the ocean probably wasn't a great deterrent to the spread of humanity. In fact, the ocean has probably played a vital role in the spread of humans throughout the planet. What we see if we start to look at ancient civilizations, that a lot of them were forced or were driven, was probably a better term, to study the ocean, to explore the ocean, travel the ocean, because of increased access to food. They would be on islands, food resources would run out or would be depleted. If you could get off the island or get off of the area that you're restricted to and travel further away, you had an increased access to food, and with that would come a nutritional advantage, as well as an economic advantage. You'd have something that you could trade for other goods. So the ocean was very important once people started traveling out on it, started to explore the world, the greater world outside of the confines of their own communities. The need to go and find food and possibly other resources, maybe even you were driven off an island due to warfare, led to advances in technology. So initially people probably first traveled the ocean on very small rafts, maybe a couple of logs tied together. But over time, new technologies were developed, new boats were developed, the use of a sail was developed, oars were developed, and new navigational techniques, ways of finding out where you were, ways of getting from point A to B were developed over the years. And we're going to first start looking at this development of boats, of ways of navigating, by looking at the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Phoenicians. We're going to start by looking at the Mediterranean Sea. It's important to note at this point that this doesn't mean that there wasn't exploration going on in other parts of the world, but for the time being, we'll look at the Mediterranean Sea and the civilizations that sprung up around the Mediterranean Sea. We're going to focus first on the ancient Egyptians. And initially, they built boats and they used these boats to trade along the Nile River. They might have occasionally traveled out into the Mediterranean Sea, but we don't have a lot of record of them being really great sort of ocean-going civilizations. It wasn't until a little bit later, when the Phoenicians showed up, that we really started to see boat building and travel sort of outside of their local area to really start to dominate. We're going to start by looking at the Mediterranean Sea. It's important to note at this point that this doesn't mean that there wasn't exploration going on in other parts of the world, but for the time being, we'll look at the Mediterranean Sea and the civilizations that sprung up around the Mediterranean Sea. We're going to focus first on the ancient Egyptians, and initially they built boats and they used these boats to trade along the Nile River. So we come to the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians lived roughly 3,200 years ago, about 1,200 before the Common Era. And we know that the Phoenicians were regular ocean traders. We see that they went out into the Mediterranean, they traveled along the Mediterranean, traded goods, which they then brought back to the area they lived in, which is now modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. We also see in the archaeological record that Phoenicians used different ship styles for trade and war. So they started to make a distinction between what ships they would use to trade with and what ships they would use to go out and fight or battle other civilizations. They were famed for their boat building skills, and they were credited with such things as inventing the keel, a battering ram on the front end of the boat, and putting caulking, sort of putting something in between planks of the boat to prevent water from seeping in. The Phoenicians were regular ocean traders, and we see that they traveled the length of the Mediterranean Sea, passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, and went as far north as Britain and down along the west coast of Africa. So they did have quite an expansive range that they did cover. And as a result, they obtained a lot of knowledge about waters both in the Mediterranean Sea as well as the greater Atlantic Ocean. We are now going to jump forward into time to a little under 3,000 years ago and look at the Greeks. And the Greeks definitely ventured outside of the Mediterranean like the Phoenicians into the Atlantic. And they were in fact one of the first groups of people in this region of the world to observe the presence of a current moving north to south. So they went out into the ocean and they found what we will discover in lectures to come or modules to come, what was known as the Canary Current. They believed that this was part of an immense flowing river, and the word for it was okeanos, which is derived from the Latin version of the word oceanus. So this is where we get the word ocean from. They also, like the Phoenicians, used ships for different purposes. So they have a ship that was specifically for war, a ship for trading, for example. Here's an image of some of the Greek ships. Once again, we have a really strong archaeological record that allows us to reconstruct these ships and what they look like. We see a couple of different types here. We can see in the forefront what was typically a Greek cargo ship. And we also see in the back something that's called a bireme. This in particular one here was used by the Greeks as a warship. You can sort of see the battering ram developed by the Phoenicians up front. A bireme means that they just had two banks of oars. So you can think of sometimes you see in movies, especially older movies, these Greek slaves, they're rowing the boats and there's these big long oars, they're sitting in benches. Some would have two levels of oars. Others, called triremes, would have three banks of oars. This is a reconstruction of a Greek warship. Once again, that battering ram at the bow, developed, as I said previously, by the Phoenicians. And you can see, I believe this one is a bireme, at least two banks of oars. So the holes down at the bottom there would have been oars out of there. And then at the topper level, there would have been oars out of that side as well, or out of that portion of the ship. You can imagine that roughly 2,800 years ago to 3,000 years ago, we had sailors from a number of different civilizations traveling the Mediterranean Sea out into the Atlantic. And one of the things that these sailors did as they began to travel further and further was to record information that they acquired on the voyages, where they went, what was there, how did they navigate to this location, what did they use to find this location. And we find as early as about 2,800 years ago that we first started having people producing charts, cartographers, map makers making maps. And we call them charts in oceanography, so a map of the ocean is known as a chart. And one of the epicenters for this accumulation of knowledge that sailors were acquiring and then taking this knowledge and creating maps or charts was in Alexandria, Egypt. So if we stay in Alexandria for a while, we'll find that around 3rd century BCE, so before the Common Era, roughly 2021 years ago, the Library of Alexandria was founded. It was founded on the orders of Alexander the Great. The Library of Alexandria was a warehouse of knowledge. All of the known knowledge of the world at that time, or that part of the world, had been accumulated and was stored at the warehouse of Alexandria. We see the beginnings of marine science here as well. Knowledge from ships entering the harbor was beginning to be accumulated. What happened is there's librarians, other people working at the Library of Alexandria. They would travel down, they would meet the ships as they came into harbor, they would collect all the information that they can. And we started to see a real flourishing of map making, as well as I've said already, accumulation of knowledge acquired from all over the world. It was a vast repository of ancient knowledge, which had many librarians over the years, head librarians and then other people acting sort of assistant librarians underneath the head librarian. Sadly, the Library of Alexandria was destroyed by fire in 415 AD, but you can see the upper picture is a picture of some of the ruins. The lower image is that of the modern day Library of Alexandria. Over the lifetime of the first Library of Alexandria, there were a number of different librarians. And if you go through history, you'll find that many of these librarians made important contributions to the science and the arts. One of these that we're going to focus on is this librarian here named Eratosthenes. He was the second librarian at Alexandria, and he's noteworthy for a number of reasons, but two that we'll focus on primarily was he developed the concept of latitude and longitude. So if you ever use a cell phone to sort of pin your location, figure out where you are, that has its basis. What that is based on comes from what way back in about 2300 BCE. So once again, well over 2,000 years ago, what this gentleman or this librarian came up with. He also calculated the circumference of the Earth to within approximately 8% of what we know of it as today. So imagine that we can measure the circumference of the Earth today using satellite technology, using all our modern technology. What he did was simple math, the sun, the shadow, and he was able to determine the circumference of the Earth, almost to a value that's very close to what it is today. So how did Eratosthenes calculate the circumference of the Earth? Before we get started, we know today that the Earth is roughly about 40,075 kilometers in circumference. And we know that Eratosthenes came up with a number very close to that. So what did he do? Well, he knew that in a place called Cyrene in Egypt, there was a well. And at noon on the summer solstice, the sun would be directly overhead and shine directly down this well. There was also a column, there were probably many columns in Alexandria, but there was one particular column that at the same time as the sun was overhead in Cyrene, so he had to wait till the summer solstice, he probably had assistants helping him. He looked at the column of Alexandria and measured the shadow that the column made at noon. From that, using simple trigonometry and knowing the distance between Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the angle of the sun, he was able to determine the circumference of the Earth. Now, there is some debate on what figure he actually determined, and a lot of that has to do with the definition of what a stadia is. A stadia was a length of distance that was used at that time, different than a mile, different than a kilometer, and that distance was variable depending on if you're looking at a Greek stadia, what you were basing that stadia on. But the important thing is here, and the amazing thing is here, is that he got so close to that value of 40,075 kilometers. And did this all with simple math and very basic tools at hand. This is a reconstruction of a map that he came up with showing lines of latitude and longitude of the world at that time as far as they knew it. You can see that unlike a map of the modern day map of the world where the lines of latitude and longitude are equally spaced, on this one he placed them through areas of important sites. So for example, maybe through the pyramids of Egypt or where Alexandria was. Another librarian, Hipparchus, invented the current grid system of latitude and longitude. So he took that latitude and longitude, the concept that was developed by Eratosthenes, and he took it a little bit further, divided the Earth's surface up into sort of segments based on a circle. So it's 360 degrees. So he broke it up into portions of 360 degrees and developed that current grid system that we're familiar with now, we might have learned about in grade school. Another person that we should mention is Claudius Ptolemy. And he was the one that sort of came up with the way that we orientate maps and charts nowadays. So if you look at most maps and charts, north is at the top, south is at the bottom. He also took the concept of latitude and longitude and divided it even further. So he took the divisions that Hipparchus created and broke them down even further into degrees, minutes, and seconds. So for example, if you look at the notation there on the slide, you can find the latitude and longitude coordinates for Wolfville, where Wolfville can be located in the world. And once again, all sort of location systems is sort of based on this initial work done over 2,000 years ago. More importantly, though, Claudius Ptolemy decided that Eratosthenes' determination of the circumference of the Earth wasn't good, and he decided that he was going to calculate it as well. But he got it wrong. He calculated it to be about 70% of what the actual circumference was. And this doesn't sound like a big deal until you get to Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, you'll find, used the wrong chart when he left for Spain to go discover the New World. So let's jump forward in time to 1492, when Christopher Columbus, famous explorer, infamous explorer, depends who you talk to, was sent out by the Queen of Spain to discover the New World, or at least to discover a quick way to get to the Far East, to be able to get to the riches, the spices, the gold, the silk, all the wealth of the Far East. So Christopher Columbus used a map similar to this 1482 recreation of Ptolemy's world map. You can see if you look at the map that they don't have the complete world on there, but we see, bits of Africa, Europe, parts of what is now known as Russia, Eurasia, Asia itself, the Indian Ocean, bits of the Atlantic Ocean. And it was based on a map like this that Christopher Columbus went out to search for that passage to the Far East. Columbus based his journey on Ptolemy's map. And what this resulted in is that he thought that the Canary Islands, so just islands just off the coast of Spain, that the distance in the Canary Islands to Japan, his ultimate destination, was probably about 3,700 kilometers. In reality, we're looking at a distance of more than 12,500 kilometers. Christopher Columbus sadly got it very, very wrong. And as you know, what he ended up doing was he ended up going to sort of the southern part of North America, and apparently, even though we know this isn't true now, founded the New World. Why we say this isn't true now, this is something that important, especially in the next sort of part that we'll be talking about in terms of the history of oceanography, is that other people already lived in this location. Christopher Columbus wasn't the first person to set foot on North America or in the New World. There were already native Aboriginal people living in that part of the world. He was sort of the first European, and as we'll find, even that was wrong, to sort of encounter the New World.